So you grew up between Ukraine and Syria. How was it growing up there? Talk about your family background.
My dad's Syrian, my mom's Ukrainian. My dad's an MD, my mom's computer scientist, and I turned out to be kind of the combination in both in a variety of ways.
How did the idea of Sky Therapeutics come along?
As you know, Chad's my co-founder and my podcast co-host, and we met during Harvard Business School. And we both got very interested in this idea of using software for therapeutic purposes. The problem in biotech is that products don't improve over time. But what if you can create software products that have a therapeutic purpose and can continue to improve over time?
So there are a lot of people who come to HBS and other business school and they want to start their own company. What is your advice?
I think it really depends on the business. I think the value of HBS is that it's an amazing sandbox, right? It's an avenue where you have a lot of resources that support you if you're interested in building a business. You have the smartest people in the world to speak to about your business idea and to pressure test it and iterate on it and get feedback.
Welcome to the Careers Not Ladders podcast, where we talk about unique paths of professional success and growth. Our guest today is Alexey Youssef. Welcome, Alex. How are you doing?
Thank you, Gaurav. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I'm doing well and really excited for the conversation today.
Thank you for coming. So like our previous guest, Alex also went to Harvard Business School where he got his MBA. But that's just one achievement out of several in his pocket. And this is going to be an exciting episode, and I don't want to spoil too much in the beginning. But here is what you should know about what Alex is doing these days. He's the co-founder and CEO of Sky Therapeutics. It's a venture-backed company developing therapeutic video games. Many years prior, Alex launched a Y-Combinator-backed biotech, a microbiome startup, not his first rodeo. Additionally, he has worked in healthcare, M&A, financial advisory, and long-short equities. Alex himself is a podcaster too, so a lot more experience than me. He co-hosts the Physicians of the Beaten Path podcast with another great friend of mine, and they interview physicians who have succeeded beyond the traditional clinical path. So that's all I'm giving away right now, and we will unravel the rest throughout the episode. So Alex, we always start with a question which goes way back. So you grew up between Ukraine and Syria. How was it growing up there? Talk about your family background, any highlights from your growing up age?
Yeah, thank you, Gaurav, and thanks for the very generous intro, and I'm really excited to have this conversation today. So a little bit of background. So my dad's Syrian, my mom's Ukrainian. My dad was a part of this generation in the Middle East who were sent by their government to different parts of the world to specialize. So he did medicine back in Syria. He was sent to Ukraine to do his medical specialty. So he was training to be an ENT surgeon, and he met my mom in Ukraine. My mom is a computer scientist. She was working kind of in finance there. And so kind of my dad's an MD, my mom's computer scientist, and I turned out to be kind of the combination in both in a variety of ways. But yeah, I was born in Ukraine. I lived there for 5 years. Then the family moved to Syria. I grew up in Syria. We were based mostly in a small town kind of in the north called Kasab until 2014, and then relocated to another city, and my parents are still based there. I have beautiful memories kind of growing up in both countries. And I think one of the unique aspects that I've learned kind of growing up in two very different cultures is I learned a lot about diversity and diversity of thoughts and opinions, and that there is no one cultural stereotype that is correct, right? Growing up in Ukraine, there is a particular cultural stereotype where people tell you should do X and Y and Z, and that's the right way to do things. Then I moved to Syria and I saw a completely different cultural stereotype that does things very, very differently. And each cultural stereotype thinks that their way is the right way, but the reality is that there is no right way. And so I think I've learned a lot about the diversity of cultures. And I think I was at a privileged position where I've seen all of these different cultures, and I was able to pick up kind of the best practices from each culture that I liked, and I kind of integrate them together. So I think that's kind of my unique experience there, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And I'll go back to your story. So your mother was a computer scientist. Your dad was a surgeon. I think your uncle was a surgeon too. Did you want to be a surgeon when you were growing up?
Yeah, I don't think that I had this predefined idea of becoming a medical doctor from like a very young age. I think I was heavily influenced by family. As you've mentioned, Gaurav, my dad's a medical doctor. My uncle is a medical doctor. A lot of our family friends were medical doctors. And so I viewed them as figures that I aspire to be when I grow up. And so I was, of course, kind of influenced by that environment. And I was very interested in medicine as a career path. But I think what eventually kind of drove me into medicine is that I have curiosity towards understanding how very complex systems work and kind of trying to break down that complexity into simpler levels and understand that complexity. And I think kind of drove my decision to go into medicine because the human body is an incredibly complex system. And surgery specifically, I think I'm trying to reflect kind of real time on this question. And I think I went into surgery because I liked the responsibility of it. And I kind of romanticized the idea of surgery, right? You have a patient who's very sick, and within a limited number of hours, you're able to kind of meaningfully transform their lives, right? And so I've attended surgeries with my dad, who was, for example, doing a cochlear transplant. So a patient couldn't hear, and then they would transplant a device in their ear and they can start hearing, right? Like you've kind of significantly changed that person's life. And so I've romanticized this idea about surgery. And I think it's the responsibility of it. It's this ability to change a person's life that eventually drove me into it, if that makes sense. So that was kind of those were the factors that informed my decision to go into medicine and surgery.
It does make sense. And interestingly, you said that you were romanticizing this idea of like being a surgeon, and you were like 17 or 18 or something. How did you think your like next, I know people don't make plans when they're like 17 and 18, but you must be thinking like, okay, this is what I'm going to be like next 10 years, then 20 years and 30 years. Were you thinking in that way?
Yeah, I think there's two phases. One phase is before kind of trouble started in Syria. I think before trouble started in Syria, my limited thinking at that point was I would do my residency in the country and I would kind of stay there, or maybe travel. It wasn't really clear, but I think after trouble started, it became clear to me that, I want to continue my residency outside the country. And the goal has always been the US. The US is incredibly difficult for Syrian students because visa is a challenge on its own, right? So throughout the conflict period of, say, 7 to 8 years when I was in the country, I think there's only a few Syrian medical students who were able to get a visa to the US. And so going to the US was incredibly challenging, but I always wanted to do it because as an international medical student, it's one of the best places to be. I would actually say it's the place to aspire to come to. And so I've had this idea that I wanted to come to the US. I did the part of my medical training in the US. So I spent a month and a half doing a clinical elective in New York at Weill Cornell Medicine. And the plan was to do the USMLE exams and come and do my medical residency. But a lot of that has changed after I got the scholarship to come to the UK, and that kind of very meaningfully changed my life trajectory.
Yeah, for sure. No, so I'll just take a step back. So you alluded to something which was the Syrian trouble in Syria, and you were trying to get your MD in from 2011 to 2018. And a lot of people know that Arab Spring started in 2011, 2012 to 2017, like peak of Syrian civil war. And you were trying to become a doctor in the middle of all of that. So how is your family handling all of that? Like, did you migrate right away? Did you wait for some time? What did you do when the whole thing was playing out?
So in 2011, I finished high school and I started medical school. So technically, the Civil War started when I was finishing high school. So, I remember doing my high school final exams, which are very important because you get into university and you get to choose your university specialty and study domain based on the results of your high school exam. So I was doing my high school final exam while there were armed clashes happening in the city. So all of that was kind of transpiring and taking place as I was finishing high school. I think reflecting back on that time, it was a surreal time where trouble started to happen, where the state of society, as you know, it started to disintegrate. So people started leaving the country, businesses started shutting down and closing, embassies started closing. But I think many were in a state of disbelief, right? People genuinely expected the situation to be over in a few months. But eventually, a few months ended up being a few years, and a few years ended up being more than a decade. And I think as things progressed, it became more and more difficult to leave. And so a few years in, leaving the country was not a realistic option for my family. And so we collectively decided that I would finish medical school back in Syria. I try to get out. Then after I get out, we'll figure out how to get the family out and what would be the next step for them. But I think that's kind of how the situation played out. I think a lot of people at the beginning did not expect kind of trouble to last. But as I've mentioned, it's a few months turned into over a decade. And I think as things went deeper, it became harder and harder to achieve.
Yeah, and then after finishing your MD, you landed in UK, you mentioned. So you were a Rhodes Scholar, and not just any Rhodes Scholar. You were the first Rhodes Scholar from Syria. And Rhodes Scholarship, like people who don't know, was the oldest fellowship in the world, probably the most prestigious, definitely the most prestigious. How important was getting this scholarship for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly important, Gaurav. It changed my life and it provided me a lot of opportunities that I couldn't have otherwise, just given kind of the context that I was in. So the short answer is that it was incredibly important.
Yeah. And was this your ticket out? Like coming to US was very difficult. UK was probably one easy way to out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was on my track to come to the US. And so towards the end of medical school, I was very lucky to get a visa after multiple attempts. And I had this clinical elective in New York. And so the idea was after that clinical elective, I'll stay around for a research fellowship and then I do my residency. But around the same time that all of those US plans played out, I received the scholarship. And so I was basically given that opportunity, and that opportunity changed my life trajectory from that point onwards.
And let's talk about that. So if anyone looks into your resume, they'll see the 3 most prestigious universities in the world. You are currently getting your DPhil at Oxford you started in 2018, I think. What is your goal with this degree?
Yeah, so I started basically in 2019. So my plan for Oxford specifically was to do 2 degrees. So that's the structure of the scholarship. You can do 2 masters or a PhD. Some students do a master's and then a PhD after. And so the plan initially was to do a master's in public health and kind of global health, because I was very interested in kind of building healthcare capacity in low-income countries. And so that was my first degree in the UK. And that degree was heavily focused on using open source electronic health records and health informatics technologies to digitize and enable healthcare systems in low income countries. And I ended up working with the World Health Organization to set up the entity that's currently rolling out electronic healthcare records in Syria. So that experience informed a lot of my thinking about the value of healthcare data and the potential of healthcare data and how we can use all of this healthcare data to change the practice of medicine. So based on that experience, I've decided to take the step to dive deeper into the space of health informatics and healthcare data. So I decided to do my PhD in computer science, specifically in healthcare machine learning. And my PhD work is focused on using electronic medical records data to build clinical decision support tools and build machine learning tools that can help the practice of medicine. So that's kind of been the timeline there and what informed my decision. But my initial plan was actually to do a master's and an MBA in the UK. But then after I did my master's in the UK, I've looked at the different MBA options and I realized that I wanted to come to HBS. And so I think that maybe answers the question around kind of my decision to do the MBA at HBS.
That makes sense. But I wanted to come back to a little bit. So you mentioned like when you were young, you wanted to become a surgeon. And then when you were at Oxford, you saw the potential like electronic medical records. How was the switch? Like, was it an instant switch? Like something happened, or is it like a gradual? You started realizing the potential of the health records and data and computer science, and you can work on the intersection?
Yeah, I think, so specifically to medicine, I think there was an element of disillusionment where going into medicine, I thought and I hoped that I could influence the lives of many individuals, but actually practicing medicine in Syria made me realize the limitation of what an individual can do in a constrained system. And so based on that experience, I realized that I want to work more on the system level rather than specifically kind of on the front lines of practicing medicine. Although I enjoyed that a lot, and I enjoyed kind of the ability to interact with patients and the ability to work one-on-one, but I've realized that my passion is to work more on the broader system level. So I think that all of those shifts that happened after were informed by that experience and that decision.
And HBS loves these kind of stories. Like, you are way beyond than individuals and you want to like change the world and make like systemic change. HBS loves all of that, and that's why you ended up at HBS. So that's great. But you're also doing MS in bioengineering from Stanford. What's the rationale? Like, why bioengineering and why Stanford?
Yeah, I mean, most of my degree was focused on bioinformatics and computer science as well. And to me, my decision to study in the different universities and different disciplines was driven by a genuine curiosity. I want to learn more about the disciplines that I'm interested in, and I want to learn more from the friends and colleagues that I would meet at those places, right? In HBS, I've learned a lot from, the standard structure of the academic program, but I've also learned a lot from colleagues like you, Gaurav, and many friends that I've met at HBS who are incredibly talented people. And so that was my mental framework to making any decision on what to study and where to study. And so, I've been given this great opportunity to come to places like HBS, like Stanford. And, I jumped on this opportunity when it was available because I knew that there was a lot of learning for me and a lot of experience to be gained in those different places. I didn't necessarily have a completely predetermined path of how I would integrate the 3 degrees together, but I believe that paths are emergent rather than deliberate. And I knew that there was a powerful intersection of the 3 degrees. And just based on this idea, I've made the decision to pursue kind of the 3 of them, but I didn't have kind of an absolutely predetermined plan of where it would land me, if that makes sense.
It is. And Alex, honestly, like, if you had a predetermined path, you would not be on this podcast. We celebrate people who have like non-traditional path, who have this emergent path coming forward. And honestly, like, I personally don't know anyone who has done amazing stuff and has like Oxford, Harvard and Stanford on their resume. So this is super cool. Congrats on all of that. Let's talk about at the end of the Harvard, or maybe in the middle of the Harvard, and maybe you should tell me, how did the idea of Sky Therapeutics come along and what are your goals with it?
Absolutely. I think during the MBA program, so as you know, Chad's my co-founder and my podcast co-host, and we met during Harvard Business School. And we both got very interested in this idea of using software for therapeutic purposes. You can have the best of the tech and biotech worlds, right? In tech, you create products that continuously improve over time with every additional interaction with the user. In biotech, you create products that have therapeutic purpose and that can change the lives of people. The problem in biotech is that products don't improve over time. But what if you can create software products that have a therapeutic purpose and can continue to improve over time? So this idea of using software for therapeutic purposes really got us very interested. And so I think throughout HBS, we've spent a lot of time looking at the research that's happening in the space. So we've decided to look at some of the academic innovations that are happening within the space of therapeutic software to try to identify academic innovations that we can integrate into our company and build a therapeutic product using some of this academic innovation as a foundation. And so we ended up looking at the work of many research groups across the US and EU. We've looked at many kind of, we call them digital mechanisms of action. So in the same way that any biological drug that you have has a mechanism of action through which it achieves its therapeutic purpose. So for example, it blocks a certain receptor or activates a certain receptor kind of in the body. And through that, it changes the trajectory of a disease and it kind of heals the patient. In a similar way, we've thought about therapeutic purpose, therapeutic software as having a digital mechanism of action, right? And so we've looked at research that's happening in the area. We spoke with many academics that are working on digital mechanisms of action, and we ended up finding a digital mechanism of action that we were very excited about. And so we ended up kind of licensing that innovation and using it as the core for the first therapeutic product that we have, which is for ADHD. But we've thought about therapeutic software in the same way we thought about drugs, where we try to identify digital mechanisms of action that are clinical trial validated and that have been developed in a very rigorous way. Because I think when you're building digital software for therapeutic purposes, you should have the same rigor that you would have when you're building a biological treatment. And so we've approached it kind of from that mindset and mentality.
This is interesting. So I guess Sky Therapeutics is obviously venture backed, and they're like different kind of VCs. Like biotech VCs are very different from like software VCs. So who did you raise money from, and like did you go like software VCs and talked about the software more, or did you talk about the therapeutics part of it to biotech VCs? Who did you raise money from?
No, it's a good question. So generally, if you look at the digital therapeutics landscape, the investors who invested in this are health tech investors, biotech investors, and pure technology investors. So all the different categories of investors have invested in the space itself. For us, so far, we've raised a pre-seed round. So we had the backing of an institutional VC that is tech focused, and we've had the backing of many strategic angels. So that's been the structure of our fundraise so far. Moving forward, we would be open to raising from both tech and biotech investors. I think both of them bring different value to the table. And I think what we're working on is inherently on the intersection of both. And so I think there's value from kind of bringing both perspectives to the table.
But are you not worried that they might have different expectations? Because like software VCs are like, okay, high profit margins, quick turnaround. Biotech VCs like, oh, we are here for long run and this is going to take long time. I mean, this is my perception.
Yeah, I mean, roughly there is similar thinking kind of in the space, but I think even the tech investors realize that when they invest in digital therapeutics, it's a different product profile than if you invest in kind of a new SaaS business. And I think it's incumbent on you as the entrepreneur to find the investor who kind of shares the long-term vision that aligns with your long-term vision for the business. And so a lot of these questions do come up in our conversations with investors. But for us, when we choose kind of an investor to work with, we will choose the investor with whom we have kind of alignment on the broader and long-term vision. And I think kind of one source of capital as well is pharmaceutical companies, right? So multiple pharmaceutical companies have been interested in the therapeutic software that we're developing. And so one potential avenue that we can pursue is a partnership or a development deal with a pharmaceutical company that would include some financial components. So that's another kind of funding avenue that exists in biotech.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about you and your co-founder, Shad. And HBS has like dedicated courses on founder journeys and like co-founder relationships. So how did you and Shad split up roles and responsibilities? Who's doing what and why?
Yeah, so basically before deciding to start the company together, Shan and I have worked for around a year on our podcast, right? So we've worked together and we've really enjoyed working together before deciding to build the business. And I think that was an important step in our decision making because the decision on a co-founder is incredibly important and it can make and break a business, right? So I really appreciated that question. But generally, the split of responsibilities is I'm handling the CEO role, Chad's handling the COO role. And so I'm doing a lot of the work that relates to fundraising, pharma partnerships, go-to-market strategies. And Chad's doing a lot of the work that relates to interacting with regulatory agencies like the FDA, for managing the operations of the company and some of the hiring components. So that's how we decided to kind of split responsibilities. And I think when we had the conversation, I remember we were like walking in Seaport and in Boston and saying, okay, what's the right split here and how we should divide responsibilities? And I think we approached it from the perspective that let's lean on each individual's strength to determine the roles that we would be managing. I think we felt that, my background and my strengths are more suited for the CEO role and Chad's background and strengths are more suited for the COO role.
And you guys complement each other very well. So there's no doubt you'll be successful. One thing I would ask is, so there are a lot of people who come to HBS and other business school and they want to start their own company while at business school. What is your advice? Couple of pieces, maybe. What would they do? What should they do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't think I have generalized enough advice that could apply to different types of business. I think it really depends on the business, but I think the value of HBS is that it's an amazing sandbox, right? It's an avenue where you have a lot of resources that support you if you're interested in building a business. You have the smartest people in the world to speak to about your business idea and to pressure test it and iterate on it and get feedback. So the way I think about it is that it's a great sandbox where you can test different business concepts, run it by, colleagues, friends, professors, mentors to get feedback and refine it. And I think you can use the 2 years that you have to make sure that your business is mature enough to the stage that you can actually go and raise capital towards the end of your MBA program. So I think it's a great sandbox, and HBS is trying to provide a lot of resources for individuals who are interested in entrepreneurship. So for example, specifically in kind of the field of healthcare, biotech, and therapeutics, they provide this Blavatnik Fellowship, which helps HBS alumni.
Which you got.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm shamelessly advertising for it, but I think it's a great program and I highly recommend it to kind of anyone who's listening and interested in launching a biotech company, because they provide a lot of resources and mentorship, and my experience with it was very, very, very positive. And so, I want to advertise the resource to anyone who's interested in a similar track.
Right. No, it makes sense. And I think you're the second guest who had that fellowship.
Yeah,
so Shardul was here too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your section mate, actually. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we had a good representation of Section D.
Yes, exactly.
Last year's go.
So once this podcast episode airs, there are people who are going to come to your LinkedIn profile. They will look at your LinkedIn. They will find out that you were enrolled at Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard. And there was a period of 2 years, I think 2022, where you were enrolled in all three. And I mean, some people will find it impressive. There will be like some other people who have this all negative thinking, and they're like, okay, maybe he's confused. So at any point, do you have doubts about what you're doing? Like, am I confused? Am I doing the right thing? Who do you talk to when that happens?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that if I reflect on the decision to pursue the education, it was driven by curiosity and by the learning that I could gain from those programs and those communities. So I think that was my main motivation. And when the opportunity became available, I took that opportunity knowing that there will be strong synergies between disciplines and fields that I would be studying. I think people can think different ways, and I think I should not be able to influence what people think because they can make their own opinions. I can just communicate what was my motivation and my thinking process of making that decision. And I think that was driven by the fact that I perceived that it's a great opportunity to learn from the program and the community. It's a great opportunity to build connections and friends. It's a great opportunity to create synergies between three disciplines. And when that opportunity became available, I just jumped on it, to be honest, knowing that under the framework of an emergent rather than deliberate path, something good that would come out of it. I think it's early to say if something good has come out of it yet or not. We'll have to see. We'll have to give it a couple of years, but I do believe that something good's going to come. So that'd be my answer there.
Who's your closest confidant? Like when you're feeling down, when you're feeling low, who do you talk to? Like, who is your biggest cheerleader?
Sometimes I talk to family, and having family as part of your support network is incredibly important. But also, there's multiple mentors who have been incredibly helpful for me throughout my journey and throughout a lot of the critical decisions that I've had to make at different time points. And I think they've been incredibly helpful in kind of a lot of the decisions and moments during this time period. And at many points, I picked up the phone and called them or wrote them an email to discuss with them some of the concerns, or at different points when I was feeling that I was like really overwhelmed, and is this all worth it? And so I think family and mentors were very helpful during these time points.
Let's talk about one of your mentors, David Pryor. Let's talk about the last time you reached out to him. What was the concern? How did he respond?
Actually, I spoke with him recently. So we're very lucky to have David as an investor in the company and as an advisor. And I was talking to him 2 weeks ago, and we were trying to get David's input on a couple of the go-to-market strategies and questions that we have. So it was very much in the context of the company and in the context of the product that we're developing.
That's awesome. And one important part of your life currently is, other than obviously Sky Therapeutics and your family and friends, is Physicians of the Beaten Paths podcast. You started this podcast with Shad. What was the goal when you started? Like how many episodes? And were there like goals beyond episodes? And where are you now on those goals?
Yeah, so I think the motivation to start that podcast is, both Chad and I are medical doctors, and doing medical school and doing residency, we did not have proper resources and visibility on medical doctors who pursued careers outside of traditional clinical medicine. In fact, this idea of, not doing residency or not doing clinical medicine after residency is still frowned upon in some clinical environments, right? It's considered something that's very untraditional, and there's a question of why would you do that? But the reality is there's so many different forces that are shaping healthcare today and shaping healthcare delivery, and being a medical doctor, practicing clinical medicine one-on-one with the patient is incredibly important. But a lot of the healthcare outcomes in the healthcare ecosystem today is driven by healthcare innovation, by new companies that are developing products in this space, by healthcare investment firms that are backing those companies, or healthcare consulting companies that are helping solve very tough problems. And so I think there is a lot of venues where having the clinical experience and bringing the clinical experience to the table is incredibly important, because frequently the decision makers in non-clinical environments are individuals who don't necessarily have that clinical experience, but they're making decisions about healthcare that influences millions of patients. And so I think increasing representation of medical doctors in those environments and making sure that we bring that clinical experience to the table is very important. And so I think for me, going through the Rhodes Scholarship, going through Oxford, going to HBS, I was able to see a lot of medical doctors who were able to pursue successful careers outside of traditional medicine. The same was Chad's experience when going to the MBA. And I think we wanted to make those resources available to medical students across the US and around the world. And we're investing a lot of our time and some of our resources to make those resources freely available, with the idea of making the conversations very kind of personal, very practical, geared toward understanding the thinking process of the guest. What do they think about when they've made these kind of critical decisions, whether to continue practicing medicine or not? And what were the steps that they took to kind of secure the opportunities that they have? So pretty much similar to kind of the dynamic and the structure that you're trying to create here, Gaurav. And I love the structure of kind of very personal, practical conversations. In a similar way, we're trying to do that for medical doctors who pursued successful career paths outside of direct clinical care. And we're trying to make that resource freely available to medical students and medical residents around the world.
And you're like 40 episodes already?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're over 40. Yeah, I'll have to double check on the final number, but I think we're over 40 for sure.
For sure. Yeah, no, I would recommend audience to check that out. It's very easy to find out. You can just Google Physicians of the Beaten Paths and it will show up. It's a great podcast. So I have last 3 questions for you and we'll make it very quick. A couple of them are philosophical, one is hypothetical. So one question I have is, what would you do differently with your life if you could go back in time? Anything at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I will say nothing, not because I don't think that there is a lot of things that I could have done differently. I think there's a lot of things that I could have done differently. And I think there is a lot of mistakes that I've made throughout the journey. And I think not making those mistakes would have probably led to a better outcome. But I think I am today a byproduct of those mistakes, and my learning today is a result of the journey that I've been through. And so I think I wouldn't change any of that because it helped me gain the experience that I have today. But have I made mistakes along the journey? Yes, many times. And would the outcomes have been better if I hadn't? Yes. But would I go and change that? Probably not, because I think there's a lot of learning that we gain through making mistakes and kind of iterating and changing our work processes based on that.
No, makes sense. I mean, you are a byproduct of your mistakes. So one hypothetical question for you. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, living or dead, who would you have the dinner with and what would you talk about?
I think I'd go for Leonardo da Vinci. I've read his biography by Walter Isaacson. It's incredible. I think what specifically I would be interested in is to understand how he thinks and what's his, mental framework, thinking approach to bringing different disciplines together. I think one of the very unique things about Leonardo da Vinci is that he worked in a variety of different disciplines, and I think he was able to innovate and come up with a lot of innovative ideas because of that exposure to different disciplines and because he was able to bring those disciplines together. I mean, I fundamentally believe that a lot of innovation happens on the intersection of different disciplines. And so I think his life journey just exemplifies that. And I'd want to spend an hour or a few hours with him just picking up his brains on how he thinks, how he solves problems, how he thinks about integrating different disciplines together. So that would probably be my choice. Can you make it happen?
No, this is great. Interestingly, so I've had like about 6 episodes of these. Everyone came up with a different answer. So I hope that continues. And all of them have been really amazing. And I definitely learned a lot from this question. And that is the only common question I ask everyone, mostly personalized to like people. One last thing I want to end this podcast on. It's the last question, and maybe take your time if you want to. This is a very deep question. So what is your hope for Syria? What can Syrians do to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that this situation is resolved. I think it's a hard question because before the conflict, there was stability, but it wasn't a long-term prosperous environment. Many people hope to remember it that way or want to remember it that way because they're romanticizing that memory of the country. But I don't think it was a long-term prosperous environment because of the structural components of the governance system and how the whole country was structured. And so stability comes back. I certainly hope that day-to-day life of Syrians significantly improve. But I also hope that there are significant structural changes that happen because if you don't create a structure that leads to long-term prosperity, it's really hard. You can have temporary periods of stability, but you're not creating a country that is on track to be prosperous long-term. And so I think there is a lot of structural changes that need to happen. And without kind of diving into kind of politics and all of those spiky topics, I think without those structural changes, it's really hard to see a long-term prosperous kind of future for the country. I think what Syrians can do is make sure that they build very successful careers outside and, they prove themselves as very kind of capable and worthy academics and medical doctors and business people, artists, and build that expat community. I think the expat community is one of the most valuable resources that we have as a country because at one point, sometime in the future, that expat community will contribute very significantly to rebuilding the country and reestablishing it. I certainly hope that moment of time comes sometime soon. But yeah, that would be my reflection there.
Yeah, I hope this wish comes true. And I am...
Thank you.
Everyone in the world should hope for a peaceful world where everyone can live happily. And it's just sad situation. I hope it comes back. So thank you, Alex, so much for your time today. This is the end of our podcast. You did amazing. So much learning, so much reflections, so much introspections. And I don't know, I remember when I was applying for HPS, I was going through the same process and I try to do it very often. So every few months, I do an introspection on how the last few months have been. And I hope this podcast helped you do again all of that. Unless you don't want to do that, but
no, I love that, Gaurav, and I think the questions have been incredible. I think it's the podcast has certainly been an opportunity to kind of practice some of that reflection, and I really appreciate the conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to listen to more episodes.
For sure.
Thank you for making this resource available.
Thanks so much, Alex. Bye.